Welcome to the Knowledge Problem Podcast. The objective of this podcast is to engage policy professionals over thought-provoking and sometimes sensitive topics. We aim to bring these professionals together in a way that does not feed into the tribalist narratives plaguing society today. It is my hope, and the hope of all involved in this endeavor, that by allowing these ideas to contend and challenge each other with mutual respect, everyone who listens will learn something not previously considered.
The opinions and views of all guests do not necessarily reflect the views of the Knowledge Problem or of anyone involved in its production.
Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Pilkington, and on this episode we have a debate exploring the motion, citizens have a moral responsibility to participate in the democratic process through voting. To argue the affirmative, Dr. Julia Maskivker is an associate professor of political science at Rollins College. She's a political theorist whose teaching and research focuses on contemporary theories of justice, global ethics, and social and economic citizenship. Her work has appeared in journals such as Contemporary Political Theory, the Journal of Global Ethics, the Human Rights Review, the Journal of Moral Philosophy, and the Review of Politics, among others. She's written 3 books, and her most recent book, published by Oxford University Press, is The Duty to Vote. Dr. Maskivker, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
To argue the negative, Dr. Chris Freiman is an associate professor of philosophy at the College of William and Mary. His research focuses on democratic theory, distributive justice, and immigration. His work has appeared in the Australasian Journal of Philosophy, Philosophical Studies, the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics, and the Oxford Handbook of Political Philosophy. He has a forthcoming book entitled Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics, with a release scheduled for later this month. Dr. Freiman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We'll begin with opening statements, starting with Dr. Maskivker.
Okay, well, thanks so much for this opportunity to argue for the idea that we do have a moral obligation to participate in politics and in particular to vote. My defense of this position does not entail arguing that this duty should be a legal duty as in compulsory voting systems. Something can be morally obligatory without that being legally obligatory. And I also think that the duty is not an overriding duty. There may be other considerations and duties that at certain times must take precedence. So that said, my position is that the duty is a very important duty because of how important it is to count with good governments. Governments affect significantly the life of people in unique ways because they distribute or they block the distribution of important social and economic goods. So other forms of political participation are also important because they affect government and what people think of government. But elections are the only mechanism that juridically and legally install governments in power. So without them, I argue, no other form of political participation would actually culminate in any sort of meaningful change, at least not in liberal democracies of the sort we want to live in. So my main idea or my main proposition is that we should see voting through the lens of a natural duty of aid or a Samaritan obligation to help our fellow citizens and society in general get rid of indecent, unjust, or incompetent leaders and public officials. Samaritan duties of aid are binding only if they're not unduly costly or difficult. We're not expected to be saints, and I argue that voting, under normal circumstances, is not a terribly burdensome activity, even though it's not costless, because it entails seeking information and understanding information that we need to have in order to vote responsibly. But this notion that voting well, if you will, with information is almost impossible for the average voter, I don't think is convincing enough. I think proponents or skeptics of my view emphasize too much cognitive shortcomings at the level of the individual, and they forget completely to point out how structural or institutional variables, such as electoral rules, the Electoral College, media manipulation, may affect what the voter knows. And if we know that these things are changeable or that we can reform them to some degree, then we have to conclude that voter ignorance is not an immutable or unchangeable law of the human constitution. We can do things to improve it. One main objection or argument against my view is that voting doesn't make sense, is irrational, because our single little vote will get lost in a proverbial ocean of votes, if you will. So why should we bother doing something that will have really no effect whatsoever on the outcome of the election? Well, this may be true, but we do a lot of things that are not terribly impactful individually, but that when we do them in the framework of a larger activity, they do work. So we generally think that we shouldn't pollute, or that we shouldn't trash or litter, or that we should recycle, or that we should donate to charity, or that we should try to minimize our racist biases, unconscious biases. And we surely don't think that just because we do this, the problem of pollution, global warming, or world hunger will be solved just because we did our part. No, we think that these activities, these common activities, these collective activities are worthy. And that's why we participate in them, even if it's true that our little single action will not change the world by itself. So I argue that we should see voting in that light, as a contribution to a common pursuit. It's a duty of common pursuit. And it's not different from many other things that we do in our daily lives. Another objection or another worry that opponents of my view may put forward is that voting has opportunity costs. And since our single action of voting will not change the results of the election, then why should we bother? Because we could do other things instead of voting. Yes, that is true. But under normal circumstances, voting does not detract from other things that matter in life. People normally vote and do other things the same day that they vote or during their lifetimes. Normally, the costs of voting, even the cost of acquiring the right information to vote well, do not entail their other activities, will be impossible. People can vote and lead the types of lives that they want to live. So I think I will leave it at that since I'm out of time.
Dr. Freiman, your opening statement.
Great, thank you, and thanks to you both for hosting this. I've really been looking forward to this, and I think my sketch of the negative case here, I think, will actually highlight some of the considerations that Julia mentioned, and argue that some of those considerations are maybe compelling in an argument against the duty to vote. So it sounds like we're in agreement that an individual vote in a large-scale election won't make a difference. I think we both agree to that. Depending on the formula that you use, depending on the state that you're in, your odds are going to be higher or lower. Maybe if you're in a swing state in a certain sort of election, the chance of your vote making or breaking a tie is high enough that it's worth doing, depending on who you talk to. But generally speaking, it's safe to say that for all practical purposes, your vote is not going to make a difference in the sense of changing the outcome of the election. So even if you imagine a scenario where you do somehow make or break a tie, that would surely prompt a recount, and the decision would probably be made in court rather than in virtue of your vote. So, like I said, I think it's safe to say that for all practical purposes, your vote won't make a difference. And I think the fact that your vote won't make a difference, the fact that it won't do any good, weakens the case for a duty to vote. It might have some kind of expressive or symbolic significance. So casting a vote for a particular candidate who stands for particular sorts of policies might have symbolic value. It shows that you stand for certain sorts of moral principles, but I'm not sure that's enough to generate a duty to vote. So let me give you an analogy, maybe to move your intuitions in my direction. Suppose you learn that an asteroid is on its way to your town. And you get the idea that you could drive across town, find some spare change, and throw the change in a wishing well across town and make a wish for the asteroid to go away. Of course, throwing a penny in the wishing well to wish that the asteroid will go away does not actually make a difference as to whether or not the asteroid will hit or not. And I think it's counterintuitive to say that you would have a duty to drive across town, find some pennies, and throw them in a wishing well in this case. Why? Well, because it's not actually going to make a difference. It's not actually going to help anyone. And I think in a lot of ways, voting is like this. So throwing the penny in the wishing well expresses your attitude towards the asteroid, but it won't actually do any good. Similarly, you cast a vote for a particular candidate. It expresses your moral attitude, but it won't actually change anything. And so if you deny that there's a moral duty to throw a penny in the wishing well in the asteroid case, it seems like you should be somewhat sympathetic to the idea that you don't have a duty to cast a vote in a large-scale election. Now, there is an important difference that Julia mentions, and I'll get to later, that collectives can make a difference in the election case, where they can't in the case of the asteroid. So it's not as if everybody throws their pennies in a wishing well. That'll make a difference. Maybe that is a morally relevant difference, and I can get to that later. But for now, it seems there's reason to be skeptical that we have duties to perform actions that don't do any good. Now, one important thing to note is that denying that you have no duty to throw a penny in the wishing well doesn't imply that you don't have a duty to help in other ways. So it could be the case you say, okay, the asteroid is coming. This is going to be very bad for me and my neighbors, so I should do something to alleviate their suffering and mitigate their harm. So maybe this means you have to help your neighbors evacuate the town or something like that. That strikes me as pretty reasonable. And similarly, to say that you have no duty to vote doesn't imply that you lack a duty to help in other ways. In particular, you might have a duty to help mitigate the harms caused by unjust government. So perhaps our government isn't doing enough to address the problem of food insecurity, poverty, racial injustice, and so on. It seems to me like what you have a duty to do is to take direct action that will actually make a difference to those harms and to the people who are suffering. So just as you might have a duty to help people evacuate and find shelter when the asteroid's coming, you might have a duty to work overtime and donate to a local food bank to help address the problem of food insecurity. And it's important to note that the time that you spend, say, working overtime and donating to a food bank will actually result in people getting fed who otherwise wouldn't get fed. Whereas casting a vote for the candidate who's best on the issue of food insecurity won't actually result in anyone getting fed who otherwise wouldn't, because it doesn't make a difference. So my view is, at the very minimum, you don't have a duty to vote. You can honor your duty to help others. You have a duty to aid, but you can honor that duty through direct action. It doesn't have to take the form of voting. You can contribute in other ways.
All right, for first rebuttals, Dr. Maskivker, if you want to go first, you'll have 3 minutes.
So one thing you mentioned is that, Chris, the analogy between the asteroid hitting the Earth and voting and the wishing well example, right? If everyone goes to the wishing well and throws a penny, nothing will happen. But if everyone votes, something will happen. So let me provide a sort of modification to your example. Assume that it's ridiculous, but for the sake of argument, assume that if everyone stomped their feet really, really strongly against the ground, if everyone did that in the country, the Earth, the planet, could be moved a few inches and miss the asteroid, right? Which is basically a good analogy for voting, I believe, because if a sizable number of people vote and an unjust or unfair government can be removed, that's an outcome that we would value and would want to obtain, in the same way as avoiding the asteroid is a good outcome. Then if that's the case, it doesn't follow in my mind that just because my act of stomping my feet on the ground is negligible or will not make the planet move by itself, that I don't have a duty to participate in this collective stomping project. I don't think it's that clear. Again, we don't view many of the things we do and that we think we should do in this light. I mean, following your logic, I believe it would not be unreasonable to conclude that maybe we shouldn't care about recycling, or that we shouldn't care about driving environmentally friendly vehicles. And maybe you think that we shouldn't, and then we reach a sort of a standoff there that maybe it's insuperable. But I do think we do have these duties of collective pursuit, if you will. We have duties not to pollute. We have duties to reduce our footprint. We have duties to donate to charity, to help fight hunger. And another thing that I wanted to say is that it's not clear that these other ways of helping that you mentioned, which are loable, are terribly effective. You may assuage hunger when you contribute to a food pantry, but it's not clear to me by any means that you will solve the problem of hunger in any effective way. You may as well do something else. I do think that many of the activities that we see as obligatory or as morally worthy in terms of helping others are of the sort that sort of motivate you to be suspicious of voting. We can't make a discernible difference only by ourselves. We need the cooperation of others.
And Dr. Freiman, your rebuttal, you have 3 minutes.
Sure, thank you. I love the thought. I love crazy thought experiments. The crazier, the better. So I appreciate that. In that spirit, let me counter your thought experiment with another thought experiment.
Sure.
Or let me explain what I think may be the difference between the foot stomping case and the voting cases. So in the foot stomping case, I think to make it analogous to voting, we would have to say something like sufficiently many people have to stomp their feet to move the earth an inch to avoid the asteroid or whatever the case may be. So maybe not everybody, but enough people. Because, of course, not everybody has to vote or vote well to get good government. We just need sufficiently many people to do that. And I think that's an important difference. And I think that might actually change the nature of the obligation of any particular individual. So here's a new thought experiment. So I think you're right about the point that, the amount of harm that any one individual can prevent is pretty small, and they aren't going to be able to change systemic problems on their own, but they can alleviate the suffering of particular people. Suppose we had the following sort of case. So this is, a Peter Singer style case where, suppose we have children who for one reason or another are tripping and falling and drowning in a big pond, and we say, okay, well, we got to solve this problem. The way to solve the problem is to fence off the pond. But to fence off the pond, we need, sufficiently many volunteers from the town to help build the fence. You say, okay, should I contribute to the fence building effort? And suppose you're in contact with the, whoever's the head of the fencing committee, and they say, look, we have more than enough volunteers for the fence building effort. So the fence is going to get built with or without you. You say, okay, given that it's going to be built with or without me, here's what I could do. Rather than build the fence, which is a noble thing to do, building the fence and preventing children from dying, what I could do is take the time I would have spent on the fence, volunteering as a lifeguard, to prevent particular children from falling into the pond while the fence is getting built. I think at the very minimum, that would be morally permissible to do. So you say, I'm not going to contribute to the collective effort, even though the collective effort is important, because my contribution at the margin is zero. The impact of my contribution is basically zero. And so what I'll do is take that time and help a particular person. And I think if you think it's permissible to do that, then at a minimum, it would be permissible to forego voting for something like more direct altruistic efforts.
So you do, Chris, mention one thing that obviously I'm aware of, and it's a really important point, which is sort of in technical terms is the problem of over causation, right? You don't need everyone to vote well in order to in order for an election to be determined. You just need a threshold of voters. That's the nature of voting. So it is true technically that not everyone needs to vote. In that sense, though, I have several things to say. First, who determines who has the moral freedom to exempt themselves, right? If you have the moral freedom to exempt yourself because you say, well, not everybody needs to vote, what makes you so important? Right? If you have the freedom, then everyone else has the threshold may not be reached, which may be an argument to justify the idea that everyone should vote. We don't know ex ante who is going to vote or how many people are going to vote, which takes me to the other thing I wanted to say, which is that when things are up in the air, and not always, right? So if you live in California, it may be completely certain that Democrats are going to win. But if you live in Florida, maybe you don't know. When things are up in the air, you may have a duty to participate in elections in order to be part of what economists called the set of efficacious votes, right? The reduced number of votes in comparison with a population that you need in order to win an election over an opposing candidate. So there are several reasons why it may be a moral duty to participate in elections, even if it's true that not everybody needs to vote in order for an election to throw a winner. Just the matter that elections are uncertain may explain why everybody, under normal circumstances, has the duty to participate in them.
So I will say, so I agree to an extent, and so here's a concession that I'll make. I think if you are a voter in a swing state in the upcoming presidential election, you should vote for Joe Biden. I think that. So I think I'm willing to concede that point.
I'm happy about it.
However, but there's always a but. So here's my but. So I think though what that wouldn't show is that there's a general duty to vote. So in the case where you just say, look, you're not a swing state voter, and there's really just I think in California it's like 1 in a billion, or I don't know what the number is, but it's so astronomically low, the odds of your vote actually flipping the election. Then I think you might be exempt. So at most we would say something like swing state voters in particular elections have a duty to vote. In the same way that, people who are in a special position to help another. So like, I don't know if you're a doctor and you see somebody with their burst appendix, you probably have a duty to, help them in some sort of way, I don't know, like perform surgery or something like that. Doesn't mean I have the duty to do it. And so insofar as the duty to vote appeals to the possibility of actually making a difference, I think that's going to give us a pretty limited scope of the duty. Yeah, and then just very briefly, in terms of the moral freedom point, I think that's a real concern, although I would also note that it's going to be a concern about other sorts of cases. So you might say something like, if too few people become dentists, or if too few people become farmers, that would be really bad. But it also doesn't seem as though any particular individual on the margin is morally obligated to become a farmer. It could be the case that if we say, we're really in danger here of like a food shortage, and so you becoming a farmer could really make a difference. Then that I might sing a different tune in that case and say, you would be obligated to become a farmer. But then again, that would just be special circumstances. So if there are cases where it's like really uncertain whether or not you're going to make a difference, and so you think the expected utility of voting is high, then I say, you probably have an obligation. But under normal circumstances, I would say, your option not to vote is similar to your option not to farm. We live in a society in which there are plenty of farmers. We live in a society where there are plenty of voters. And given that as background, you don't have a duty to vote. If things change, maybe your duty changes, but not until then.
Dr. Maskivker, what level of deliberation and research is required for voters to fulfill a duty of voting well?
Well, that's an important question. It's an empirical question, obviously, that refers to the problem of voter competence or incompetence. And And in my book, I devote a whole chapter to this problem. I don't intend to dismiss it when I argue for a duty to vote. But, philosophically speaking, the fact that some people or a lot of people may not be in a position to fulfill a duty does not necessarily mean that the duty is philosophically indefensible. For example, we would all agree that there's a duty not to kill, not to steal for unjustified reasons. We do know that a lot of people kill and steal for unjustified reasons all the time. We don't think that the duty not to kill then loses stringency just because a lot of people do not discharge it. I believe that in the case of voting as a duty, we may adopt a similar rationale. Just because some people are not in a position to fulfill it because they may not know anything about politics or may not be interested does not mean that the duty philosophically is unjustifiable. So in the book, I propose a standard of good voting. That's what I call good enough voting. I could spend hours talking about this. First, I would like to say, as a matter of introduction, that I do not think that the knowledge required for minimally good voting is tremendously difficult to acquire, as sort of the skeptics or my opponents might think. We don't need a PhD level of knowledge and information in order to make a minimally informed decision at the ballot box. This is a representative democracy. We choose delegates so that they govern for us, and they are expected to be the experts. If we had to be the experts, then we would do the governing ourselves. And even in models of direct democracy like ancient Athens, where the general public was not knowledgeable in this technical sense as a general norm, democracy worked pretty well for as long as it did. So back to the standard of good voting that I propose in my work, I sort of divide it into two conditions. I call it the fair-minded condition and the epistemic competence condition. The fair-minded condition entails the idea that people had to vote with a view to the common good. We can debate what the common good is, but the idea that people should not be voting with a view to their own pockets or their own sort of narrow self-interests. And we know from extensive political science research that people vote in this way. Generally, a lot of people vote in this way. We call it, political scientists call this sociotropic voting. So this is not an uncontroversial premise generally. The epistemic competence premise is where things can get a little murky, but it's truly an empirical problem. As I said before, I do not intend to dismiss the problem of voter incompetence, but I think two things: that we can expect the average voter to make minimally informed decisions if the right institutional and structural conditions are in place. There are a host of variables of institutional and political design, especially in the American democracy, that explain why a lot of people don't care about politics or don't know about politics. For a start, indirect elections, the Electoral College, right? If you think about it really, really carefully, the last presidential election, the popular vote gave the victory to Hillary Clinton. So if you're going to dismiss democracy on the basis that people are stupid or that they elect bad leaders, that case does not really fly when it comes to the American democracy in the last election. True democracy would have meant that Donald Trump would not be the president today. And then you have other structural variables that may explain voter apathy, such as electoral rules that give majorities that do not permit proportional representation and do not give voters many alternatives, only two parties, the almost complete capture of certain politicians by special group interests, the unrestricted use of money in politics. All these things contribute to people not knowing, media manipulation, not knowing or not caring. And I'm not saying this is not a problem. What I'm saying is that the problem of voter incompetence and voter apathy is not immutable, is not an act of God, and it can be changed for the better.
So, Dr. Freiman, one major objection to proponents of not voting is that not participating in the political system is only an option for groups of privilege, but it's not so easy for oppressed groups because the result of voting is seen as an outcome that could mean life or death. How would you address this particular objection?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that is an important objection. But here again, I'm not sure that worry speaks in favor of a duty to participate in politics. I think what it speaks in favor of is a more general duty to alleviate injustice. And generally speaking, I don't think that voting is a way to do that, or at least an effective way to do that. So by analogy, you might say something like, look, it is a privilege to not have to worry about malaria in your own life. And I think that's right. But from there, it doesn't follow that you say have to take distinctively political means to combating malaria across the world. So like maybe casting a vote for American foreign policy to focus more on treating malaria, that would be one option. But it's not going to be a very effective one because it won't make a difference. You might say, what I should do is, in fact, here again, work overtime and donate to the Against Malaria Foundation. So I am privileged not to have to worry about it in my personal life. And maybe I do have a duty to alleviate this problem that afflicts the lives of others. But that just leaves open the question of whether or not we have to take political means to alleviating it. And just, my own 2 cents, I think what we ought to do is take the most effective means to alleviating these sorts of problems and combating these sorts of injustices. So here again, you could say, it's a privilege to not have to worry about where your next meal is coming from. It doesn't follow that the best way to help people who aren't so lucky is by voting. Maybe you say, look, more people will actually get fed if I disengage from politics, spend the time that I would have spent on politics, donating or working at an understaffed food bank or something like that. That will actually be a more effective way of solving the problem than voting. So just sort of long story short, I think that objection is well taken, but I don't think it implies that you have a duty to vote. So there's a distinction between politics being very impactful, which I think is indisputable, and then what your obligations with respect to that impactful thing are. So maybe we go back to the asteroid case. You could say, look, if you live in a town that's not going to be hit by the asteroid, you're really lucky. Does that mean, though, that you have an obligation to go to the wishing well and throw a penny in the well to make sure that the asteroid goes away? I would say no. Why? Well, because throwing a penny in the wishing well and wishing for it to go away is not actually going to help anyone. So maybe what you should do is help people evacuate or something like that. Similarly, politics is very impactful, but casting a vote, again, is kind of like throwing a penny in the wishing well. If you don't think you have to throw a penny in the wishing well because it's inefficacious, I would say, oh, you don't have to vote because it's inefficacious. But what you do have to do is take steps that actually help people and reduce injustice.
So this question is for both of you. Outside of voting, what moral responsibilities do we have to one another? Dr. Maskivker, if you want to go first.
Obviously, consistent with my position is that voting is a Samaritan duty of aid towards others, right? In the same way as we have a duty to stop on our way to work, and if we see a fire, a building in flames, and someone trapped inside, we do have a moral duty to stop and call 911. We don't have a moral duty to go into the building ourselves and put ourselves in danger. Morality does not require us to be saints. That would be too much. But it does require us to be, in the words of philosopher Judith Thomson, decent Samaritans, I believe. So in this sense, we might have an insuperable disagreement here, right? I do think that positive duties of aid or rescue or assistance are existing and are real. And Christopher here may not agree with me, and we may hit a wall there. So, but I do think that I actually think that the duty to vote is justified or predicated on a sort of prior duty to support just institutions, right? It's kind of like a natural duty that you have towards others, not only fellow citizens, to support just arrangements that may dictate that you refrain from doing certain things that harm others, or that you do certain things that help others. And in this respect, I wanted to point out what I think it's an inconsistency. I'm not saying this is necessarily Chris's position, but it is a prevalent position in the skeptic literature. This idea that we have a duty to refrain from voting badly. If we don't know what we're doing, we don't have the information, that we shouldn't vote. This is something that Jason Brennan, for example, argues in his book, right? Because if we vote when we don't have knowledge about the alternatives, we are contributing to a collectively harmful activity, he says, and others agree with him. Well, but it's very clear that a single bad vote will not tilt the election to a bad candidate. A single bad vote is as ineffectual as a good vote. It doesn't make a difference. And if it doesn't, then why are we saying, or why are they saying, that we shouldn't do it? It's a contradictory logic. If something doesn't have an instrumental value, it doesn't make a difference itself, then we shouldn't bother doing it on this logic. But they don't argue that. They argue that the duty is to refrain from voting badly. I think that's a glaring inconsistency. I would argue that if you do have a duty not to vote badly, which I agree, we do have a duty not to vote badly, that obligation is not based on the instrumental value of not doing that, what we're not supposed to do. It's based on the idea that it's wrong to do certain things. It's wrong to donate money to a genocidal political party, even if the money is $5. We know that we won't make a difference. $5 is still little money to help the genocidal candidate buy weapons of annihilation. But it's wrong to do that. Simply speaking, it's just wrong to do certain things. It speaks badly of who we are. So in the same vein, it may be the case that we have a duty to do certain acts that, together with many other similar acts, contribute to a result that we may have reason to value, even if it's true that we can't change the world alone.
So I think it's fair to count me among the skeptics, although I actually agree with you about the duty to vote badly, or the duty not to vote badly point. I am a skeptic of the claim that Brennan makes that you have a duty to avoid voting badly for the same sort of reasons that you get. So at least I'm consistent. Maybe I'm consistent in a crazy way, but I'm consistent. And you know, so it's kind of hard to know what to make about some of the intuitions in these cases where you're casting a bad vote. My hunch is that there's something expressive going on that we find objectionable. So it's like, you know, imagine that there's some sort of great philanthropist who's receiving the Nobel Prize, and you're watching the ceremony at home, and then you just decide to give the philanthropist the finger. You think, that kind of seems wrong. You say, but why is it wrong? It's not like it's contributing to anything in like a causal way. It's not making anybody worse off. It still seems wrong. Okay, well, why might it be wrong? It seems like maybe there's some kind of expressive, but doing this act expresses some kind of bad attitude or character trait or something that you have. So, do you have a duty to refrain from doing that? I don't know. I'll set that aside. But that's a long-winded way of agreeing that I think if you really think the action with respect to voting concerns its instrumental value or the lack thereof, then it really is not clear why you have a duty to refrain from bad voting, absent some sort of expressive consideration. A couple of quick points. Yeah, so I would also say, and I'll talk about the Samaritan duties, but I would also say I'm happy to say that democracy is a very valuable, indispensable institution. But I don't think it follows from that you have a duty to contribute to democracy in particular. And, not to belabor the analogy, you could say things like farming, sewage, neurosurgery, all these sorts of things are also really valuable. They're very impactful. But it just doesn't follow from that that any particular individual at the margin has a duty to contribute to those. So, your local fire department provides a really valuable service. Well, that's in special circumstances. I don't think you have an obligation to be a volunteer firefighter. Now, again, there could be circumstances in which you are, but I don't think it's a kind of across-the-board duty in the way that a duty to keep your promises, not to murder, and so on. In terms of the duty we have to others, I think I maybe am more inclined towards the saintly side, which gets me into problems with demandingness and things like that. But one thing I will argue for is something like a conditional duty of effective altruism. So the idea here is that all else being equal, you ought to direct your help in the way that does the most good or alleviates the most suffering. And this kind of sidesteps some of the demandingness worries. So I wouldn't take a stand here on what quantity of help you're obligated to give. So you don't have to follow Peter Singer and say something like you have to give up 80% of your income or whatever he used to say in the 1970s. You might say maybe you're only obligated to give 10% of your income to helping, or 10% of your time to helping, or something like that. My view, and this has been defended in various places by other philosophers, is that insofar as you're dedicating that 10%, you ought to deploy your philanthropic resources in the most effective way. So an analogy would be you have a bottle of water and you say, okay, I'm going to give it away. I don't need it. And so it would be good to use it to help others. And you could give it to somebody who has messy hair and they'll use the bottle to, slick back their hair and look good. Or you give it to somebody who's dying of thirst. I think in that case, you're obligated to give it to the person who's dying of thirst, because the suffering that you alleviate by giving it to them is just so much greater than the suffering that you would alleviate by giving it to the person who just has messy hair. And I think this ties back into the voting case. So, if you just say, look, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to disengage from politics entirely. I'm going to turn off CNN. I'm going to stop reading the newspaper because I think, my political participation is causally inefficacious. And I'll just reallocate all the time I would have spent on politics to some sort of effective altruism. Like I'm working overtime and then I'm investing that and getting a decent return. And by the end of my life, I've got, who knows, $100,000 saved and donated it to the Against Malaria Foundation. And I saved, 30 lives or whatever the number is. I think that our duties of aid, our Samaritan duties, actually point us in the direction of private altruism, rather than, what you might call political altruism, precisely because the suffering that you can alleviate via private altruism is so much greater than the suffering you can alleviate via political participation.
So since the U.S. abides by an electoral college, do you think the duty to vote is more pronounced in electorally relevant states? This is for both of you. Dr. Maskivker, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I do have a couple of points in response to Chris's comment. But they're not inconsistent with your question. So several things, because it was packed with interesting and important points. First, I'd like to say that the generalization argument, right? This idea that society needs farmers or doctors, but that doesn't mean that we individuals have a duty to become farmers or doctors, because if no one did, then disaster would happen. I think that's a flawed logic. I agree with you, but I steer away from it. In my book, I argue that the justification for the duty to vote is not based on the generalization, sort of Kantian logic, what would happen if this became a universal type of norm, right? I actually rely on sort of Parfit's collective consequentialism. The idea is that when a lot of people do X, then result F is likely to happen. And if that's the case, then I have a duty to contribute to this not happening if it's a bad result, or to this happening if it's a good result. This is not the generalization logic that you're criticizing, and that I agree with you. Is the idea that we have a duty to contribute, however modestly, to larger activities that will have a discernible impact. So, for example, think about taxes. I mean, your tax payment, my tax payment, unless you're Bill Gates or someone of the sort, it's probably negligible in terms of how healthy the coffers of the state are. I mean, if I refrain from paying taxes or you refrain from paying taxes and we didn't get caught, really nothing much would happen. Does that mean that we have a duty not to pay taxes? I would argue no. We have a duty to pay taxes because the act of paying taxes, when everyone follows suit, results in an outcome that we have reason to value, which is a healthy, rich enough state that can finance schools, roads, bridges, and other programs. I think we should think of things like jury duty or paying taxes in this sense, right? These things are enforceable because we know people generally will not think in this way. They will be dishonest, but that's a bad line of behavior, right? In terms of other things that may be more effective than voting, listen, I agree with you that there are many other things we could do to help others. My position in no way entails the idea that voting is the only way to help others or the most important or most effective. But I do think that it's unique in a way that other mechanisms of assistance are not. So the result of this, or the outcome of this, may be that I do think that morality is a little bit more demanding than we would care to admit. Maybe we do have duties to help others in ways that you mentioned, helping the poor, the hungry, but that doesn't mean that we get off the hook when it comes to voting. And I'll give you an analogy. Again, it's a fanciful example. It's not realistic, but for the sake of argument, it may work.
Those are the best. I like those.
All right. Well, say your friend just had an accident, and I use this example. I have used it before. It's in my book. Say your friend just had an accident, and he's in crutches. His leg is broken. You both are waiting for the bus, and there's no one else around. It's just you and him, and he needs help boarding the bus, your help. And when the bus is coming, you say, and he needs to get to an important appointment, you say, listen, I'm not going to help you board the bus because I just don't want to, or I have other things to do. I'm sorry, I'm in a hurry, but here's a check for your credit card debt. Well, of course, he needs help with money. He has to pay student loans. It's a great gesture. You are helping him, but that doesn't let you off the hook when it comes to helping him board the bus. You should do both. And if you think that's too burdensome, there's where the idea that maybe morality is a little bit more demanding than we would like to admit, short of asking for saintly and heroic acts. I actually think that there's nothing wrong with arguing that certain things, certain positive acts, things that require us to act for others, are obligatory because I don't think they're too costly. Now, you may disagree with me and think that anything that requires more than restraint is already too burdensome, and that we reach that disagreement there that has to do with our sort of deeper commitments or opinions about what we owe to others. And then finally, I would like to add that voting may have some instrumental value, even if it's true that a single vote doesn't make a difference. It may have contributory value. Say we may vote, we know that we won't till the election. We may want to contribute to the margin of victory or defeat of a certain candidate. And you will reply, well, but you have the same problem there. Your influence will be so minuscule, not so small. Yes, but really, it only takes me 15 minutes to vote. And in a few hours of getting the right information, I don't need a PhD in political science. I can use cognitive shortcuts and read the New York Times, and people may not even know what the New York Times is. Granted, I concede that point. We need to educate people, but leaving people out of the process instead of working to educate them is, I think, would result in worse policy outcomes for the democracy overall. And lastly, if you really care about big trends and structural change, if you really care about hunger or poverty or racism or racial discrimination, it's true. You may help. You may contribute to solving these problems by working or volunteering in your food pantry or in inner city schools. But if you really care about changing structural injustices, what more effective way than participating in elections, which actually change governments who are responsible and powerful enough to modify these big trends and injustices? I argue that there's no more obviously efficient way to do this than participate in elections. And as Brian Barry said in one of his books, what most efficient thing could you do in 15 minutes? Then you could do anything else that you want. You could go around your own business and help others, but voting shouldn't detract from some of those worthy goals.
Yeah, thank you for all that. At the risk of biting crazy bullets, so I'll just start with the tax case. I don't know. So suppose I have certainty that my tax dollars won't make any. So suppose God comes to me and says your tax dollars will make no difference, but if you artfully evade your taxes and use the spared income, by donating to the Against Malaria Foundation, you'll save a life. I'm not so sure that you shouldn't evade your taxes in that case. Maybe that's crazy. Mm-hmm. But I think if we really, like I said, if God tells us that it's negligible and that you can actually save a life by evading taxes, I don't know if I'm too opposed to that. I don't know if that's the crusade that I want to fight, but it doesn't strike me as crazy. And so I agree with you that we have strong positive obligations to help. I think that's right. But I also think one disanalogy with the friend in Crutch's case is that helping your friend in that case is actually going to do good. So your friend will actually be better off. That their welfare will be higher as a result of your help. Whereas in the case of voting, no one's welfare will actually be higher if we're, again, just assuming that an individual vote is going to be inconsequential. So I would go back to the earlier case where you say, okay, we've got this big problem. Children are drowning in this pond. And so we're getting a bunch of volunteers to build a fence to prevent this from happening. So I think you have so let's just say in this case, you have strong positive obligations to prevent children from drowning. I think that's correct. You say, okay, I can contribute in, two ways here. I can help with the fence, or I can serve as a lifeguard and actually help individual drowning children not die. And you learn that, the fence is going to get built with or without you. And so you say, given that my impact is, negligible in this case, and given that any time that I spend so this goes back to the sort of the case about the collective activities. You say, this collective activity is very important. But insofar as I contribute to that, I can't contribute to saving the lives of individual drowning children. I think at the very minimum, it's permissible for you to go to the fence builders and say, hey, look, you've got this. You don't need my help. I'm not going to go home and watch TV. I'm going to contribute to saving drowning children in a different way, namely by serving as a lifeguard while you all build the fence. So I think, again, at a minimum, it's permissible for you to serve as a lifeguard rather than contribute to the fence. It might even be obligatory. I don't know if I want to push that, but I think at a minimum, it's permissible for you to do that. And I think that you honor your duty to help in that case by foregoing the collective effort for the individual effort that will save particular people. And so by analogy, you say like, okay, we've got sufficiently many voters, let's say, such that your individual vote is not going to make a difference. And so you say, okay, voters, you've got this in the same way that the fence builders have got it. And so while you all are working on this collective project, I'll take the time and resources that I've spared, donate to Against Malaria, whatever your favorite charity is. Again, I think that's at a minimum permissible. I don't think that you're dishonoring a duty of aid when you do that. And then just very briefly on the structural change point, here again, I think you could make the case for a division of labor. So, I totally grant that politics is the way to make structural changes, but I still think that leaves open the possibility that you're not obligated to work for structural change when you know that your work will be causally inefficacious. So maybe an analogy, so we say like right now, it's probably the case like one of the biggest problems facing the world is, the COVID outbreak. Say, okay, to get to the root of the problem, we've got to come up with a vaccine. That sounds right, but it also seems right that there's just no way that I'm going to contribute to the development of a vaccine in a meaningful way. Some people can. So medical researchers can. And so I think they are obligated to go after the root of the problem and come up with a vaccine. But given that I can't really solve the root of the problem, it seems, again, at a minimum permissible for me to allocate my time and effort to forms of help that will make a difference. So maybe I can't really help with a vaccine, but I can, make or donate masks to particular people who might need them. So I can help particular individuals, even if I can't change the root of the problem. And here again, I think that's permissible. And similarly, you might say, like, I can't really bring about large-scale institutional change with my single vote. So it's permissible for me to take the time I would have used on the vote for other forms of philanthropy.
So one thing I wanted to ask both of you is, with voter disenfranchisement so prevalent in the United States, especially with our high prison population, do you think that impacts how does that impact to what extent who has a duty to vote?
Yeah, the entire gamut. Yeah, well, I think it's rather uncontroversial to say that that the state or government or politicians should not be infringing on people's rights to vote. Right? This is a different question from whether voting is a duty or an obligation, right? I mean, I think we all agree here. Chris probably agrees with me that voting is a right. And if it's a right, he'd probably think we have the choice whether to exercise it or not, short of governmental coercion, that is. So it's morally wrong, suspicious, and also unjust that people are deprived of that right for political gain. I mean, it's to me, it's incredible. I think this is a characteristic of the American democracy that actually, coincidentally, many of my opponents or skeptics of the view I defend sort of, I think, concentrate on many of these characteristics are almost associated with the American case and argue that democracy fails or doesn't work. It's true, but the fact that electoral rules, for example, are up to each state. Each different state in the union can decide how to count votes, what the districts are, what requirements are demanded in terms of IDs and such. In most other democracies that deserve the name, these things are much more centralized at the national level, which entails a smoother functioning of the franchise. That is, there are fewer opportunities. I'm not saying these democracies are perfect, but I'm just talking about this particular issue. When things are centralized or controlled in a less fragmented way, then it's more difficult for local politicians, to manipulate the way in which votes are counted or elections take place. So I do think that these are some of the structural, if you will, or political architecture variables that I was referring to that need urgent reform, and that I think because of justice they do, but also I think instrumentally, if many of the things were reformed or improved, I think voter apathy and voter knowledge would certainly improve.
Yeah, so I think I agree with everything Julia just said, so I don't have a ton to add. So right, I certainly endorse the claim that everyone has a right to vote. And so I think various measures that result in disenfranchisement are unjust because they deprive people of the right to vote. But so there's a distinction between saying that everyone has the right to vote and saying everybody has the duty to vote. And I would just say, everybody has the right to, free press, to start a newspaper. But that in and of itself doesn't imply that people have an obligation to start a newspaper. So I'm more than willing to say that the country's political system can be improved in all sorts of ways, and it has many, many problems and involves lots and lots of injustice. I think that's all correct. And there's a lot of room for improvement. And that people's effective right to vote is violated in many cases. I think that's all true. But I think the question of whether or not people have a duty to vote is just a separate question.
Okay, so that's all the questions I had. Dr. Maskivker, would you like to pose a question to Dr. Freiman to answer?
All right. Well, I do have one question. We didn't really talk that much about it, but it is related to the discussion about voting as a duty. So what is your view about recent and not so recent defenses of sort of epistocratic rule? Right? The idea that, if some people can't vote well, then they shouldn't vote, or maybe we should deprive them of the right, or design some sort of political system in which their voice is not heard. One of my problems with that view is that I think it ignores, it's completely oblivious to a sort of obvious fact of political life, which is that politicians respond to incentives. They want to win elections and gain power and stay in power. And in liberal democracies that work minimally well, they do that with votes. So there's ample political science research that shows that when turnout is high and a lot of people vote, politicians tend to pay more heed to the demands of voters because they know that they have to, because if they don't, they will get voted out. So this is a really clear and beautiful mechanism. May not be the most morally loable, but just to be realistic, it is a mechanism that historically has worked, right? Politicians deliver on their promises, or they want to help voters if they know that they need their votes. And historically, we know that democracies have delivered better outcomes than non-democracies in terms of equality, in terms of prosperity measured as in terms of GDP, in terms of peace. Democracies generally don't go to war with each other. So the idea that an elite political class would rule benevolently for others, it makes, theoretically it's beautiful, but it's very unrealistic. I mean, why is that idea more factually plausible, probabilistically speaking, than the possibility that the average voter becomes more knowledgeable? Why should we believe that elite rulers will govern with a common good in mind without that incentive that elections or that high turnout provide? Why is that more probabilistically more plausible than just thinking that the average voter may become more knowledgeable if we throw back civics into the classroom, or ask Fox to stop spreading lies? I was just reading several string of research papers that came out recently that showed that the Fox viewers were more likely not to wear masks or to dismiss the danger of the pandemic. Yeah, big news, right? So we know that media manipulates and creates voter incompetence and ignorance. But we can work on these issues, I argue. But so why is... I was just curious about what you thought about all this, if I made any sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I agree with you. I think, democracy is as good as we've got. Like Sen says, functioning democracies don't have famines. And that's pretty incredible in world historical terms. And they're really good. And so even though you might call me, I don't know, like a voting skeptic or something like that, I wouldn't want to say exactly that I'm a democracy skeptic. I might be more skeptical than you are, and I can explain that in a minute. But like I said earlier, fire departments are good institutions and valuable institutions, but that doesn't imply an individual obligation to become a firefighter, except in special circumstances. So I think everything I say about the lack of a duty to vote is compatible with saying, look, democracy is good and it's valuable and it's indispensable. But that, I think, just leaves open the question of whether or not you have an individual obligation to contribute. Because there are lots of really valuable institutions out there that you don't have an obligation to contribute to. So I think you have to contribute, to the common good in some way, but that doesn't imply that you must contribute to politics in particular. But now let me circle back. I'll say a little bit more about why I think I'm somewhat more skeptical about democracy than you are. So I agree there are all sorts of problems and that the system could be made a lot better than it currently is. But I still think that there's a deeper problem that these reforms aren't going to be able to fix. And I think that's just because of the futility of an individual vote. It's not really rational for a voter to acquire the information needed to vote well. Or maybe even more concerning is it's not rational for them to try to de-bias themselves. So you say, people have all sorts of crazy views about all sorts of political issues these days. But in some sense, it's rational for them to be irrational. So this is Brian Kaplan's argument from The Myth of the Rational Voter, where he says there's no benefit really to having unbiased, rationally formed beliefs about, the minimum wage or something like that. Why? Because you can't really do anything useful with those beliefs. So maybe it means you vote for the right candidate, but it's not as though your vote for the right candidate is actually going to change anything. So it would sort of be like if somebody said, okay, you tell one of your students or you tell your class, all right, we're going to have a quiz tomorrow, but only if I win the lottery tonight. And I say, well, what are the odds of that? And they're like, 1 in a billion. I say, okay, well, probably not worth my while to study for the test because the odds of actually, having that knowledge make a difference are just infinitesimal. So it's not worth it. So I agree with you that there are things that we could do to make democracy better. But I think the core problem is just the futility of an individual vote, which makes it rational for people to be quote unquote irrational in the sense that they just don't really de-bias themselves. They don't acquire information and so on. It's a lot harder for me to see how to fix that. Now, I don't think we can move from that claim to the claim that epistocracy is better than democracy. I mean, maybe, that's a debate that political philosophers can have. But I do think it curbs my enthusiasm a little bit about how much better we can expect voters to be.
Okay, yeah, great points about the rational ignorance or the rational irrationality point, right? You rightly point to Kaplan's argument about how a lot of what we see may be due to in terms of ignorance, maybe due to the fact that the argument is more or less this, right? People know at some level that their vote doesn't matter, so they indulge themselves in sort of irrational thinking because they know they don't have to be strict or rigorous about their evidence and their cognition because it doesn't matter. I do point this out in my work. This logic to me doesn't make much sense, or it's completely unfounded empirically. Kaplan does not do enough work to persuade us that this makes sense. And let me explain why. If the voter knows that his or her vote won't matter, why does it make sense to form a belief and fervently defend it or live by it? It would make more sense to say that if he or she knows that their vote doesn't matter, then he or she won't care about politics. I think it's more plausible to think that the average voter has the erroneous belief that their vote is more influential than it really is. And actually, Ilya Salmin in his book on, what is it called? His 2013 book on political...
Democracy and political ignorance.
Something like that. It's a long title. But he does mention, I don't have the page right here, but I do have it in my book. He does mention that several studies that show that upwards of 80% of voters in the United States think that the probability that their vote will have a meaningful impact is much higher than it really is. So I think Kaplan's rational irrationality argument is an ingenious, theoretical, little idea, but it's not really. It doesn't fly in the face of political reality.
So if I could just briefly jump in. So I think that's a good worry. But I think so. In response to the question of why are we having why do we form political beliefs, or why are we voting at all? I think that's an important question. I think the answer that a lot of people would want to give, and I think that I would want to give, is we engage in politics and we form political beliefs in order to express and protect our identity as a member of a particular group. In the same way that, this is an old analogy. I cheer on my favorite sports teams, and I form beliefs about my favorite sports teams, not because I think that it's going to make any difference, but because that's part of my identity as somebody from Philadelphia and who roots for the Eagles. That's just what I do. I know I'm an irrational sports fan. I'm biased in my evaluation of my sports teams. And maybe if the stakes were super high, for my beliefs, I might be more rational about it. But no, by expressing my belief about various political matters, I express my membership as a member of Team Republican or Team Democrat or Team Libertarian, Team Socialist. And so I think that's one answer to this worry, is that it's not exactly instrumental value that people are looking for. It's expressive value.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, guys, I don't want to keep you guys forever. So if we want to move into closing remarks, Dr. Maskivker, if you wanted to go first.
Well, thanks so much. This has been so fruitful and so much fun. Just as a way of closing, then I would like to say that voting is valuable as a duty of common pursuit. As I said, it's not morally good. I say that it's morally good to do things that, together with other similar ways of acting, result in outcomes that we have reason to value. I don't think the opportunity costs of voting minimally well are terribly high. Voting does not detract from the time or the opportunity that we may need to do things that matter in life. In fact, people vote and go on to do things of value to them all the time. So I don't think that voting is an obstacle to living the life that we may want, or even to helping others in other ways as we may want. So I said before, I didn't say this, but I would like to bring John Stuart Mill to our discussion. By no means a Democrat in the sense that we would call a Democrat today. He said in his Considerations on Representative Government that the vote is a trust, it's not just a right, because it gives us power over other people. I'm assuming he was aware of the fact that one single vote would not tilt generally an election to one side or the other. But I think this statement hides the assumption, or entails the assumption, that voting is a collective activity, that when a lot of people do it, then it becomes a powerful activity that may have the capacity to change society for the good or for the bad. Another reason related to this why voting should be seen as a duty of assistance to society and others is that it can guarantee what I call, or what I refer to as, freedom from domination. Right? It gives the people as a collective entity the power to unseat, to control, and to unseat those leaders that are not fulfilling their mandates in the way that they should. Empirical studies in political science and sociology show that higher turnouts in elections generally entail more egalitarian and inclusive policy outcomes because, as I said before, politicians pay attention or heed to the needs of the voter. This is a basic fact of democracy. Whether we like it or not, it's the way in which politicians respond to incentives. We can live in domination not only when we live under the auspices of a tyrant, but also when we live under the auspices of an unresponsive political class. And what better and most effective way of breaking the cycle of unresponsiveness than waking up and shaking things with a ballot and throwing the bombs out? Eventually, I argue this is the most valuable power that voting as a collective act can give us. This is an instrumental justification of voting. I'm fully aware of the fact that there are other justifications for voting that are equally valuable, having to do with the value of popular sovereignty or collective self-government. The idea that we treat each other as equal when we allow each other to vote. Finally, I would like to go back to the issue of political knowledge. Many of the problems that we see today in society and in government may not be directly traceable to political ignorance or political incompetence, but also to political apathy or indifference. And these two things are not the same. Some people may know, or may be smart to know, but may not care after many, many, many years of disregard or unresponsiveness on the part of politicians. But voting is still a very efficient way to break that cycle. It may not be the only, or may not be sufficient to break the cycle of injustice and irresponsiveness, but it's necessary. Finally, Aristotle, in the Politics, also by no means a Democrat or a friend of democracy, as we all know, argued that political knowledge is not the type of technical knowledge that a professional like an architect or a doctor would need to have. He actually gave this example of an architect building a house for a potential owner, and the architect not necessarily having all the information or knowledge necessary to do a good job, but the person that would live in the house, the layperson, the non-expert, would have much to contribute to the endeavor. I argue that democracy, at least representative democracy, should be seen in that light. We shouldn't expect citizens to be experts and technocrats. We should expect them to know minimally what they need to know. But this should not be an impossible task to achieve.
Great. Well, yeah, and thank you for that, and thank you, Julia, for the whole conversation. This was fantastic.
Oh, yes,
so let me just say a few quick things in conclusion. So just to reiterate, I think democracy as such is a valuable institution. I think the right to vote is an important institution. I think it's good that lots of people exercise their right to vote as well. I think the issue is, again, whether a particular individual on the margin has a duty to do so. And here I would maybe return to an analogy that I gave earlier. So you could say, like, having a free press is very important. The right to print a newspaper or start a blog or something like that, that's really important, and we wouldn't want the government to infringe on that. But that doesn't imply that any particular individual has an obligation to, say, start a blog. Maybe particular individuals do, but it just doesn't follow from the claim that the free press is very important, that a particular individual has to contribute to it. And maybe one way of thinking about my position is as a division of labor. So voting is a collectively valuable activity, but there are lots of valuable activities. And I think that at a minimum, you have the option to choose which sort of valuable activity you undertake. And so maybe it's helpful to think about this in terms of a micro level analogy. Suppose we're all on a camping trip and we say, it's very important that everybody has enough water to drink. And so it seems like this would mean we want sufficiently many campers, going to a well and getting enough water. But now, assuming that we already have enough water, you might ask yourself, okay, what should I as a particular individual on the margin do? If I know we don't need any more water, but in fact we need something like firewood, it seems like at a minimum it would be morally permissible for you not to gather water, but to gather firewood instead. So gathering water doesn't really benefit anyone, but gathering firewood does. And so I don't think you do anything morally wrong in this case by contributing to the camping trip with firewood rather than water. So everybody's making their own contribution, but they're making it in a different way. And so similarly, you could say, look, it's important that we have sufficiently many people voting and contributing in that way. But if we have enough, then just like it's okay to gather water when we have enough people gathering firewood, it's okay for you not to vote and engage in direct philanthropy as well. You don't have a duty to forego philanthropy to vote, or at least it's permissible if you choose to ignore politics altogether and allocate the time you would have spent on politics on philanthropy. And this brings me to my last point. And I think this might be a deeper point of disagreement between Julia and I. So I do think the opportunity cost of voting is pretty high, or at least the opportunity cost of voting is higher than we might initially anticipate. So one worry about my views, you could say, look, election day doesn't come around too often, and it only takes a little bit of time to vote. And so why not just do that in the time that you have on election day? It doesn't really preclude you from doing other sorts of valuable activities. I think that's right if we look at the act of voting in isolation, driving to the polls, casting your vote, and leaving. But I think if we take into account the amount of information we have to acquire, maybe the amount of debiasing that we have to do, then the opportunity cost gets higher, and we're taking more and more time away from other philanthropic efforts that might actually help people. So if you have people who are radically misinformed about, say, basic principles of economics or political science or moral philosophy, and you also have people who are prone to biasing or to processing the information they acquire in a biased way, I think it's going to take a decent amount of effort for them to get informed and de-biased. And so you might say, is it really worth all the effort to do this in order to cast a good vote if it means you're taking time away from, say, working overtime and donating to the Against Malaria Foundation and saving a few lives? My view is that at the very minimum, it's permissible for you to say, look, the opportunity cost of becoming a good voter is high enough that I'm not going to do it. I'm going to use my spare time and resources to doing more direct philanthropy, which is a higher chance of helping people.
I really enjoyed this so much.
Likewise. Thank you for doing it.
The back and forth was wonderful.
But I really do enjoy your work very much.
Oh, well, likewise.
Thank you guys so much.
Well, thank you so much. And we'll keep in touch.
Enjoy
Bye-bye.
the rest of your vacation.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Knowledge Problem Podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Also, consider following our social media accounts to stay up to date on new developments in the show and to share your opinions. We'd like to give one final thank you to our guests today for taking the time to engage in productive conversation. We would like to also thank our sponsors, Young Voices.